Good morning, everyone. I am welcoming today Richard Kozul-Wright, who is the Director of Division on Globalization and Development Strategies at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He is our leader in action that will speak to us about an interesting report that was published last year, Trade and Development Report of UNCTAD, Financing a Global Green New Deal. Richard, welcome this morning.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, you're going to be speaking to an audience later this morning here at IDRC in Ottawa about this global Green New Deal that you are evoking, you and your colleagues are evoking at UNCTAD. But before we get into this, why don't you say a few words about who exactly you are? You're an economist by training, but how did you end up working on this?
Yeah, I finished my PhD in the University of Cambridge and then went from there to the UN in New York, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And in one of our endless restructurings that we do at the UN, I was moved from New York to UNCTAD in Geneva in 1993. Initially working on issues around foreign direct investment, but then moving to the team that produced the Trade and Development Report, which is a 40-year-old now publication that UNCTAD has produced.
And UNCTAD has a tradition of having these reports that are quite important, that provide kind of beacon or state of the union on a particular topic. You're coming this year with this report, or last year in 2019, on this new global Green Deal. What's in it that is important to know, for a lay audience like me, for example?
Yeah, it's actually the third really of a trilogy. I mean, it's an attempt to come to terms with the anxieties that have not only, I think, characterized developing countries, particularly since the financial crisis, but we would argue before that, but also as this sense of anxiety that has become a feature of advanced economies too. Mm-hmm. People, working communities, governments, civil society really kind of getting this sense of anxiety that they can't really achieve what they want to achieve anymore. And the economics behind that is something that UNCTAD has been working on from a development perspective for a long time. That has obviously been compounded over the last decade or so by the concern about the environment. So the big question is, can we deal with these economic anxieties around inequality and insecurity, whilst we also deal with this threat of an environmental breakdown linked to global warming. So that's, I mean, this report is a real attempt to kind of not only look at the causes behind these problems, but to try and offer solutions that combine economic development, a sense of social justice, and the desire to recover the environment.
And you're bringing the report, perspective where, I read, the initial thinking that was behind the Bretton Woods, post-war, rebuild European society, but also, securing that the system works for everyone. Then you bring example that it has its limit. And we saw probably the most important one with the global financial crisis of 2008. And now you're bringing climate change and those inequality in the picture and saying there's a need to refresh this, big deal that we have between nations. So what are the key elements there in this deal?
I would just to step back a little bit. I think it's because we're in a kind of anniversary season these days. Last year was 75th anniversary of Bretton Woods when we wrote this report.
This year, will be 50 years of IDRC.
And this year, of course, is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations,
Absolutely.
The San Francisco conference. And there's a narrative around that basically says this has been a kind of continuous period of multilateralism improving and refining itself over that 75-year period, and we don't really go along with that story.
Yeah.
That is, we fundamentally believe that in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a fundamental shift in the workings of the global economy around the rise, in particular, of financial markets, footloose capital, that transformed the way in which multilateralism worked. And it was that form of multilateralism that led to the crisis of 2009. And so we're looking at what we're trying to do in this report is to look for ways of recovering a kind of multilateralism that I think was present in 1944, 1945. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and development was not part of that original Bretton Woods agenda, really. That's why UNCTAD was set up in 1964 to try and introduce a stronger development dimension. So, but there were some real features of the 44, 45 multilateralism that have subsequently been lost in this kind of world of hyperglobalization. So we want to try and recover some of those elements of the old multilateral system as we introduce these new challenges around inequality, around the environmental breakdown, and the idea of a Green New Deal, which has become popular in political discourse in some countries in the West, provides a useful narrative, we think, for thinking about that combination. And the elements of the Green New Deal are pretty much the same everywhere. We have to end austerity. You can't have the kind of agenda that we think is necessary to deal with inequality and climate breakdown in a world of austerity. So ending austerity is a fundamental part. Increased public expenditure, obviously around renewable, the shift away from carbon into renewables, improving energy efficiency, increasing the importance of care and the care economy, have to be delivered by the public sector from our point of view. So that more redistributive tax, the fiscal system, we think has become far less progressive and far less effective in providing resources for the kind of public investment agenda we're talking about. So that need to boost the fiscal side of the story is part of our agenda. Bringing in the private sector, crowding in the private sector is an important part of this. But we, and UNCTAD has long been an advocate of industrial policy. We don't think you can undertake the kind of structural transformation we're talking about without having serious industrial policy as part of that story.
And what is the response or the receptiveness of what you have put in the report by government? Because, public policy is at the center of this report, and the role of central bank and the role, of policy for transiting towards, new economy, this global new Green Deal. What has been the responsiveness?
Look, I mean, it's mixed. Everyone is aware of the extent of these problems now, I think in a way that wasn't true a decade ago. So when we look back at the time of the crisis, which also coincided, if you remember, with the Copenhagen COP, which was a very controversial COP. People had a lot of expectations that this would be the COP that really put climate solutions onto the agenda. And it fell apart largely around development challenges. That is, developing countries did not feel the developed countries were serious about providing them with the financing and technology that they thought they required to meet these goals. So I think 10 years on, I think awareness is much greater. And we've had initiatives. We had the discussion in the United States, obviously, around the Green New Deal that was tabled by Ocasio-Cortez and Markey. We've had discussions in Europe, and the European Commission has now come up with its own European Green Deal, which I think has many of the elements that we want to see in that kind of initiative. Yeah. Whether it's enough we're still waiting for the details to be launched by Brussels, but we've had an indication of those. So it's. I think there's a much greater openness to the idea than, say, a decade ago, when people were also talking about a Green New Deal in Europe and the United Nations, and it never really went anywhere. Yeah. But I think the mood is more conducive to that. But with any large-scale challenging policy agenda, there's going to be conflicting interests and trade-offs and difficulties that policymakers worry about.
So, in Western economies or developed economies, this message, is starting to emerge, in different form. Maybe alliance will be built, the multilateral will kick in, the bilateral will kick in. What about development? Take, I don't know, Nepal. What's in it for them with this report?
I mean,
it could be, an African country, that are facing all the adaptation require. But, what is in it for them?
I mean, it's ultimately the most important question for us, and where we need to take, because the report itself and the narrative is pitched at a fairly high level of abstraction, although it's a level of abstraction that is talking to reforming the multilateral system in a way that is much more supportive of development in general. Right. So we, the kinds of reforms that we are proposing to the multilateral system, which involve the need for a dedicated climate bank that can invest in both mitigation and adaptation in the developing world. We talk about, picking up a theme of Elizabeth Warren's, about the need for a green Marshall Plan in which technology transfer is part of that story. We argue very, very strongly in this report for the need for debt relief on a significant scale to make sure that the developing countries have the financing space to be able to undertake the kinds of investments. So there's a reform of the multilateral agenda that we think is very pro-development that comes out of this. Of course, each country has its own specific domestic challenges. And in that context, UNCTAD has been a long-standing advocate of the need for more policy space in developing countries. We believe that part of the problems of this hyper-globalized world is that the space that available to developing countries has been significantly cut back through trade agreements, through bilateral investment treaties, through this movement of footloose capital in a way that's highly destructive, through tightened intellectual property law, a whole slew of areas where policy space has been lost and needs to be freed up to meet the specific. The challenges in Nepal are going to be different from the challenges in Mexico. And it's ultimately the job of domestic. I don't think it's the job of international civil servants to dictate plans to developing countries or to developed countries, for that matter. So it's very much about finding ways to add to the policy space so countries can really address those problems in a more specific way.
We've talked of alliance to do this. We're talking about the policy space. I think that I have you, and I'm going to ask you, you mentioned crowding in the private sector. We saw recently in the news, BlackRock CEO making, statement about decarbonization. We see it, yesterday I was in New York City, that was one of the main topic at the table. What's your perspective on the role of private sector and how can they play a key role? Because the amount of money is impossible to raise only by the public sector. So how do you see it?
We take a very, I guess, for want of a better word, a kind of Keynesian view on this. That is that it's the job of the public sector to provide a healthy, demand-led environment in which the private sector can find the right profitable outcomes, in this case, in areas linked to mitigation and adaptation. That puts us at odds, I think, to some extent, with the dominant discourse on the role of the private sector, which is around themes of public-private partnership and with the public sector essentially subsidizing the private sector, and particularly private finance, to get into these high-risk, long-term projects, which are not really attractive in a world where short-term returns and shareholder values dominate the financing environment. So, our position is that, and we are very kind of strong on it in this report, is that the current structure of global finance is not conducive to financing this kind of large-scale public investment-driven project. So we need to see reforms of the private financing system. We need to see a bigger role for public banks. We need to see a bigger role for central banks, not simply as inflation targeters, but a broader set of goals that they need to introduce into their mandates to be able to meet the kind of financing challenge that we're talking about.
And that's an area that we have seen evolving quite fast in the recent past. Canada is moving towards that direction. Mark Carney at the Bank of England has been moving towards that direction. Also, he'll be a special advisor to the Secretary General, later next month. If you had a magic wand, what would you use it for in order to get this moving into the right direction and start to fix the problem that is not only with Canada or the UK, but that is a global problem all over the world? Climate change and inequalities.
I mean, I think for us, we can't address those two problems in a world in which footloose capital is essentially allowed to do what it wants to do, where it wants to do, and how it wants to do it. Because that has been a very destructive and destabilizing factor over the last 20 years. So the need to re-regulate finance, both at the national level, using capital controls, using the central bank in its role as a regulator, but also at the multilateral level too. I mean, one obvious area that, again, has received far more traction recently than was true of the past, the whole problem of illicit financial flows, of tax avoidance and tax evasion, the role of tax havens in hiding large profit. I mean, these are areas that need very, very urgent attention if we are going to bring about the kind of change in the rules of the game that can meet both inequality and climate challenges.
Well, Richard, it has been a pleasure to have you with us this morning. We have not pronounced the word research one time in this short interview, but behind all of what we have been discussing, there's a need to capture, the knowledge, to find innovation, and to apply it for solution. And that's what UNCTAD has been doing for years, helping the world. This morning, you help our audience to understand better about what is a global Green New Deal. I encourage you to read the report available on the web at UNCTAD website. And Richard, thank you again for your time this morning.
Thank you, Jean. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.